Well, it's good to be back with you for another day of Bible study. Good morning. My name is Kevin Young, and I serve here as lead clergy at Christ Table. If you'd like to know more about Christ Table, then you can visit that URL right there, www.christstable.today. Would encourage you to sign up for our email list there. And if you find these Bible studies helpful, feel free to make a donation to us. We can use your support, but we don't do that just without returning anything to you. We have spiritual resources that we give for free and send for free to those in the mail who donate to us regularly. And so check us out. And either way, thanks for being a part of what we're doing here at Christ Table. Now, if you'd like to know more about this study in particular, you can go right there to go.christstable.today/ancientpaths. We are working through 6 weeks of ancient practices that the early church utilized in order to maintain and grow their faith. And if you'd like to be a part of this study, if you visit that URL, there are a couple of things there that I'd love to draw your attention to. First of all, there's a PDF that gives you the entire reading schedule and study schedule for this, so you can get that as well. And though we sent this curriculum guide to all of our regular donors in print through the mail with some other things, you can download the PDF copy of this for absolutely free. It includes extra information about each of these 6 ancient practices that we're talking about. It also includes the readings, the full Bible text for the day. It includes discussion questions for you to utilize either in your own study or for you to use around the table with your partner, your spouse, with your kids, or even if you're leading this as a Bible study. And so we'd love to give that to you for free. And you can get it right there at that URL, go.christstable.today/ancientpaths. Now, this week we find ourselves in the 3rd practice that we are focusing on. We started with prayer, the liturgy of the hours, the first week. Last week, we focused on saints and how this example was a practice that allowed the early church to see what a lived faith should look like and then emulate that. This week, we're going to do one that is near and dear to my heart, at least the feast part rather than the fasting part. The early church utilized food and the table and meals and hospitality in order to deepen their faith. It wasn't just a side thing on Wednesday nights or once a month dinners with the church family. This was all of the time. These regular communal meals were, if not the first, they were one of the first and immediate practices that the early church did. In fact, we see that in Acts chapter 2. Verse 42, where it lists 4 things that the early church immediately did right after forming, and meals were one of those 4 things. So what did they do at those meals? Well, they met together for fellowship, for encouragement, and for the Lord's Supper. Now, whenever we think of the Lord's Supper, communion, we think of kind of 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or sometimes if it's really long, 15 or 20 minutes that's tacked on to a service, sometimes weekly, sometimes monthly. If you're Baptist like I was growing up, quarterly. That wasn't really the case. Worship time was meal time. They would sit down at a table with food, and the blessing of the bread and the wine was the communion, and worship time was meal time. They would worship and talk and converse and learn, all in the context of a meal. So that's what we're going to talk about this week. Feasting, but also fasting, because fasting is a part of spiritual practices as well. This rhythm of both communally worshiping Christ and being a part of the body by taking in, but also a rhythm of not taking in, fasting. So we're going to actually begin our time together this morning in the Hebrew texts of the Old Testament in Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 through 6. Now, this is going to kind of be foundational for us, because one of the things that's important for us to remember is that Christianity comes out of Judaism. And so it's easy for us to think that Jesus was a Christian and the early apostles and Paul and all of these folks were Christians, but they didn't begin that way, or many of them maybe even really ever identify that way. It was very difficult for them to think of themselves as being something different from Jews in the way that they worship. They saw how they were living as being a fulfillment or a next step or an outgrowth of Judaism. And so we see that in the writings, we see that in the text. And so what that means for us is their spiritual practices were deeply baptized into the rhythms of Judaism, especially first century Judaism. And so a lot of these practices that we're talking about, you may have noticed this idea of saints, this idea of a regular rhythm of prayer, and now feasting and fasting are rhythms that come out of Judaism and come out of ancient Judaism specifically. So that's where we're going to find ourselves today in Genesis 18, kind of seeing some of the genesis, unintended, I guess, of that idea of there being power in food and in meals and especially in hospitality. So we're going to go back to Abraham, and Abraham is kind of the father of Judaism. He also is considered a father of Christianity. He's also considered a father of Islam. He's considered a father of several other religions as well. And so Abraham is a very, very important figure for a predominant number of major world religions. And so it shouldn't be surprising to us that we would find much of our thinking and context in Abraham and in his story. So Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 through 6, and I've got the New Living Translation today. So the Lord appeared again to Abraham near the oak grove belonging to Mamre. Clearly, we see hints here of something that if you've read Genesis will not be a surprise to you. But Abram had a conversational relationship with God, according to the text, that they were in constant communication with each other. I really love what I see about the relationship between Abraham and God. What we see in a lot of it is a very specific relationship that allows them to converse in ways that to us might feel a little bit offensive or odd to speak to somebody who is so holy and sacred in that way. But for Abram, what we see is a normal conversational relationship and connection that I think should inform the way that we interact with God. Not that we shouldn't treat him as holy, but we shouldn't treat him as being too holy in that we can't relate to God or converse with God or be transparent with God or be frustrated with God or even, I'd say, be angry with God. He can take those things. And we understand that because we see that in Abram. So one day Abraham was sitting at the entrance to his tent. He's a Bedouin. He's nomadic in that he travels. This was the rhythm and the style of living there, especially for those like Abraham who had many animals and livestock and things like that. As there was a sense of both being able to be mobile and yet still trying to stay as immobile as possible. But they were occasionally and often on the move. And so he's sitting at the entrance of his tent during the hottest part of the day, which would have been a season of siesta and of repast. He looked up and he notices three men standing nearby. When he saw them, he runs to meet them and welcomes them, bowing low to the ground. Now, what we're seeing here is ancient Near Eastern hospitality. We're seeing this kind of culture that is embedded both in place and in time, but also in Abraham. Hospitality is a through line that runs through Judaism. Did it begin with Abraham, or is it kind of modeled after these texts and these stories that arose out of Abraham's life? Maybe difficult to say, but Abraham certainly, if he isn't the genesis of this idea of hospitality in Judaism, especially in ancient Judaism, that he certainly is the one who is looked back to as being a example of the way it should be done. And so we see this hospitality where he jumps up, he runs to meet them, he welcomes them, he bows low to the ground. There is this sense of importance and treatment and hospitality and kindness and care that's there even before there's an awareness of who these individuals are. So it's the first foot. It's the opening line. It's the first thing out of the gate. And I wonder when people think of Christianity today, when people interact with Christianity today, I wonder if their first sense of who or what a Christian or Christianity is radical hospitality. I don't know what your answer would be. I'd actually love in the comments for you to let me know. But I don't think for most people that's probably the impression that they receive. Now, there are individuals who are radically hospitable and who lead with that, and it just seethes out of every pore and fiber of their being. But I don't think that generally, by and large, that if we were to take a poll, that most people's first thought or first experience with Christianity or Christians is radical hospitality that gives us pause, like happens here with Abraham. And I think that's a failure. I think that's a major failure. And I think part of that is we see this, and we will see this duplicated in the early church. We will see as we continue on through this week that there was a spiritual rhythm of hospitality that is specifically born and bred at the table with fellowship and with a meal. So, my Lord, he said, if it pleases you, stop here for a while. So this is customary, but also extraordinary from what we know of the context and the considerations, the normality of that time period. Rest in the shade of this tree while water is brought to wash your feet. Just extraordinary hospitality to our senses, to be treating people this way who are strangers. There doesn't seem to have been an interaction yet to see why they're there, what they're doing, where they're traveling to, whether or not they're friend or foe. That says something. And since you have honored your servant with this visit, let me prepare some food to refresh you before you continue on your journey. I can remember being in college, and we had this church that was about an hour away from the campus. And one of our friends, it was her home church, and she invited us to go and be a part of it. And so a group of us decided to go and just fell in love with the place. But it wasn't so much, in fact, I'll tell you, it wasn't the doctrine or the worship services that we fell in love with. It wasn't the Sunday school class for college kids that we fell in love with. What we fell in love with was the radical hospitality of this church. This church, I mean, we weren't putting any money in the offering plate, whenever we came, but they sent a van every Sunday for us, an hour each way in order to be a part of this church's worship. It wasn't like we were doubling their attendance either. There were 6, 8, 10, at most times a dozen of us who were going. It was a church of 300, 400, 500, 600 people maybe. So we were a drop in the bucket. They would make a meal just for us after the services because we missed on campus lunch. That was, to me, an example of radical hospitality where nothing was received in return other than the knowledge, I think, that you were living the way of Christ and living the way of Abraham. Since you have honored your servant with this visit, and that was the feeling for us, since we had simply honored them with our time and our interest, they prepared food to refresh us each week before we continued on our journey. All right, the guest said, do as you've said. Who's going to turn down? Who's going to turn that down, right? Some hospitality, some washed feet, an opportunity to rest. So everyone runs back to the tent, and this is what he says to Sarah. Hurry, get 3 large measures of your best flour, knead it into dough, and bake some bread. Now, I don't have time to go into this here, but this idea of bread and hospitality is throughout Scripture, feeding others. If we were to look at all the times where Abraham utilized bread, where God utilized bread, manna, bread from heaven, Bethlehem, translates to house of bread. It's where Jesus is born. Jesus uses bread as a symbol of his body and the life that he's given to us. Heaven and Revelation, this afterlife where we are all together with God, is pictured as being a banquet, a great feast. Much of Jesus' ministry, especially in Luke, takes place at the table. It's woven throughout Scripture, this idea of feasting and bread and hospitality. Get 3 large measures of your best flour, knead it into dough, and bake some bread. Sometimes I think that the most spiritual thing that you can do is simply bake some bread. For you, for those who are worshiping with you, to give away. In fact, we, as a family, bought a bread maker. We have a sourdough starter. We make bread all the time, and it has become a sacred and a holy and spiritual experience for us. And giving away a loaf of that bread is maybe to the recipient not as meaningful as it is to us, but it is though we are giving our love, our heart, our faith whenever we serve this bread around the table at a meal to other people. It's always for us the most important thing that's on the table because it has our faith baked into it. Hospitality. Sometimes making bread, being hospitable, feeding yourself and others with this rhythm is the most spiritual thing that you can do. Well, until tomorrow, happy reading.